Shunned by Democrats and estranged from his family, RFK Jr. has long been desperate for validation. So desperate, in fact, that he has now joined forces with none other than Donald Trump. Of course, as the most prolific anti-vax conspiracy theorist in the country, RFK Jr.'s endorsement of Trump on Friday was a long time coming. And frankly, they have a lot in common. Both have enormous egos that definitely cloud their judgment. Both rely on misinformation to prey on people's fears. And both leverage their last name for their own self-interest. But for Kennedy, this also marks another act of rebellion against his own family and the institutions that they helped to build. So he may share the same name as his father, but he could not be more different. See, his dad, the real Robert Kennedy, was driven by a genuine concern for the health and welfare of the American people. He was a champion of the underprivileged and the vulnerable. He appealed to people's better angels, not their worst instincts. And when it came to modern medicine, he said those who with power and influence have a, quote, obligation of responsibility.
I think that, as I said at the beginning, I think the medical profession has made a major difference in the United States and will continue to make a major difference in the United States. But I think that we have to recognize, those of us who have the advantages that you have and that I have, that we have an obligation and responsibility to those who do not.
What Kennedy was saying there to a group of doctors in Indiana, that was the audience, that it's not enough to merely do no harm. He felt strongly that people in a position to help others have an obligation to do so. Needless to say, the apple has fallen pretty far from the tree. It's out of the orchard. RFK Jr. has not only failed in his obligation of responsibility, he's actually done the opposite. He's used his privilege and his name to encourage the most vulnerable Americans to turn their backs on modern medicine. He used falsehoods to stoke widespread fear of even routine vaccines, including the vaccines that eradicated measles, mumps, and polio. And now, if Trump and Kennedy have their way, parents will once again have to worry that their kids could be susceptible to life-threatening diseases at school. But here's the thing. RFK Jr. is not only insulting his family's legacy, he's also trying to sabotage the party that his family helped shape and influence for more than 6 decades. Remember, his endorsement comes just days after new reporting shows his candidacy was costing Trump more votes than Harris. Don't forget, RFK Jr.'s political ambitions were financed by Donald Trump's biggest billionaire donor. So by endorsing Trump, he's confirmed what we suspected all along, that his entire goal here was to be a spoiler for the Democratic ticket. Look, we still don't know what the real impact of this endorsement will be, and maybe, as Dan Pfeiffer just said, there isn't a big one at all. But what we do know is the headline should not read, Kennedy endorses Trump. They should read, dangerous conspiracy theorists join forces. RFK Jr. no longer represents the Kennedy family. He is the opposite of the legacy that his father, his uncle, his siblings, and cousins have tried to carry forward for decades. RFK Jr.'s endorsement of Donald Trump prompted a strongly worded response by members of his own family. On Friday, several of his siblings signed onto a family statement issued by his sister, Kerry Kennedy, saying, quote, our brother Bobby's decision to endorse Trump today is a betrayal of the values that our father and our family hold most dear. It is a sad ending to a sad story. Kerry Kennedy is a human rights activist and a lawyer. She's also Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s sister. Kerry, thank you so much for joining me this afternoon. I really appreciate it. And I just wanted to start. I mean, that was a very powerful statement, and I imagine it was pretty painful to have to do. But why do you feel so compelled to speak out at this moment?
You know, I think this is really the stakes this November couldn't be higher, which is exactly why my whole family will be fighting so hard to reelect Kamala Harris and Coach Waltz, who've been champions for the values that my family has fought for years. Donald Trump is the polar opposite. He's a threat to the most basic freedoms that are core to who we are as Americans, the right for women to control our bodies, the right to live in communities safe from gun violence, to love who you love. And I think if my dad were alive today, the real Robert Kennedy would have detested almost everything Donald Trump represents. His His lying, his selfishness, his rage, his cynicism, hatred, racism, fascist sympathies, deliberate misinformation about vaccines, criminal felony convictions. Daddy was the Attorney General of the United States. His rape of E. Jean Carroll, his contempt for the poor and suffering, for ethics, democracy, healing, his cruel sneering at human rights for suffering of people in America and around the world. And these are the causes that was loved so passionately by the real Robert Kennedy. So I'm outraged and disgusted by my brother's gaudy and obscene embrace of Donald Trump. And I completely disavow and separate and dissociate myself from Robert Kennedy Jr. in this flagrant and inexplicable effort to desecrate and trample and set fire to my father's memory.
It is, and I imagine, again, incredibly painful given how much your family has done for so many decades. And I touched on that in my opening. I know you touched on that in your statement. I wanted to ask you about something J.D. Vance said about your brother's endorsement. He said, quote, he wishes he could see his grandmother's reaction to RFK's son and namesake, and let's be honest, the most authentic to his dad's legacy, endorsing the people's president, Donald J. Trump. What do you make of that?
You know, well, there is not much that J.D. Vance says that holds any water with me. I think what you need to do is people need to do is look at the facts. Wages are up in our country. Inflation is down. Small businesses are booming. Manufacturing jobs are coming back. Harris and Biden have capped the cost of insulin to $35 for those on Medicare, lowering prescription drugs and healthcare costs across the board. Student loan relief has reached nearly 4 million Americans. First bipartisan gun safety legislation in 30 years. And, you know, since 1989, there have been 51 million new jobs created in the United States, 51 million. 1 million by Republicans, 50 million by Democrats. So if you care about your children, you care about your grandchildren, there's only one way to vote in this election. And it is for Harris and Coach Walz.
Your brother was on Fox this morning, and he said he has a big family and that only a few are troubled by his actions. It doesn't seem that way from the statement, but you know your family well. What is your reaction to that?
So every single one of the people in my generation, except for Bobby and one cousin, are for all of us. All the rest of us are endorsing President Kamala Harris.
While Democrats were focused on their epic convention this week, Donald Trump was desperately scrambling for attention, even trying to gaslight America with statements like, quote, "My administration will be great for women and their reproductive rights." To crib from Vice President Harris's acceptance speech, simply put, Trump is out of his mind. And in another bizarre twist, Trump welcomed the endorsement of Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who announced the suspension of his Titanic of an independent presidential campaign. During his joint appearance with Trump last night in Glendale, Arizona, RFK Jr. blasted the Democratic Party, saying it was in a, wait for it, conspiracy with the media to keep his campaign from taking off. He also made clear that he sees Trump as a partner and fellow victim.
In the name of saving democracy, the Democratic Party set itself to dismantling it, lacking confidence in its candidate, that its candidate could win in a fair election at the voting booth. The DNC waged continual legal warfare against both President Trump and myself.
Several members of the Kennedy family quickly condemned the move, writing in a shared statement, quote, Our brother Bobby's decision to endorse Trump today is a betrayal of the values that our father and our family hold most dear. They also restated their support for the Harris-Walz ticket. Joining me now, Maya Wiley, President and CEO of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. Jennifer Rubin, Washington Post opinion writer and author of Resistance: How Women Saved Democracy from Donald Trump. And Barbara F. Walter, author of How Civil Wars Start and How to Stop Them. Thank you all very much for coming back to the Saturday show. Okay, so we got to talk about Robert F. Kennedy Jr. so we can stop talking about Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Maya, what impact is this going to have on the 2024 race?
Very, very little, except it does give the Harris campaign a lot of opportunity for a lot more attack ads. Having sat in a House congressional hearing with Kennedy Jr. on vaccines and on the conspiracy theories that he spread around those, I can tell you that I think you can expect the word weird to continue to circulate from the mouths of the campaign and its supporters when it comes to being able to take on any kind of sense that this is something that might change the dynamics of this race. I mean, and we know from polling that about, frankly, Kennedy supporters were not very strong supporters. They were not deeply committed to him, and that both Harris and Trump really kind of divided up his constituents. So I don't think this will have much impact at all, except in attack ads.
Jennifer, speaking of polls, so this is an average of national polls. I'm going to put this up here on the screen, and you can see there. Before Vice President Harris took over the top of the ticket, with Kennedy in the race, Trump was leading President Biden. Now with Vice President Harris at the top of the ticket, she's leading Trump with Kennedy in the race, and with him out of the race, it's just a two-way race. She gets a bump up. What do you make of this?
Well, I think the more people know about Bobby Kennedy, the more people who are sane will not want to vote for him. I think he is a perfect match for Donald Trump. And in fact, if I were J.D. Vance, I would stick by the phone, because he might be just the kind of guy that Trump would pull in as an October surprise.
Oh my God.
He is freakish in every sense of the word, whether it's picking up bear roadkill or eating a barbecued dog. But much more seriously, he's a nut. He is a conspiracy nut. He's a racist. He has come up with all of these cockamamie theories of persecution. In that sense, he's very much a Trump rather than a Kennedy. And I have to say, it's a very sad denouement to the Kennedy legacy. And I think his family is justifiably very embarrassed and really ashamed of him.
Barbara, does RFK Jr.'s endorsement, especially given who his family is, does his endorsement of Trump, does this play into the autocrat playbook? I'm trying to understand why Donald Trump so desperately wants RFK Jr.'s support.
I think Trump wants to win, and anybody who could give him votes is somebody he's going to embrace. And RFK, I think, in addition to being weird, is also opportunistic. He contacted the Harris administration to see if there was a place for him in their administration.
Yeah.
He's clearly hoping that he can get something if Trump wins. He's a really interesting character. The Harris administration wants nothing to do with him. And if we talk about voters, it's because most of the left-leaning voters who were likely to vote for Kennedy have already gravitated over to Harris. Mm-hmm. So the ones that are left are either people who aren't going to vote because they truly are independents, or they're already Trump-leaning, and that's where they're going to go. He's off the ballot everywhere except, interestingly enough, Michigan and North Carolina. Those are swing states. Michigan is a key state. Trump has been campaigning there in the last few days. That's a key state for Trump to win. And actually having Kennedy on the ballot in Michigan probably hurts Trump. So Kennedy is a really weird guy. If he really wants to help Trump, I'm not sure this is the best way to do it.
You know, Barbara, let me stick with you since you mentioned that Trump's been campaigning in Michigan. I mean, he was just in Howell, Michigan, which back in July, which was just last month, you had your far-right wingers, white supremacists, marching through their streets chanting slogans like, "We love Hitler, we love Trump." Can you please, I mean, what message is it sending? What message is Trump trying to send by going to a place that had something so openly racist and vile happen on its streets?
So I actually don't think Trump is in Howell because he wants to send a signal to white supremacists that he's one of them. Although Trump is definitely racist, and that is a very passionate part of his base, I think he's in Howell, Michigan for very, very practical reasons. As I said before, Michigan is key. The closest margin of victory in the 2020 election between Biden and Trump was in Michigan, and the election in November is going to be decided by swing voters in swing states. And Howell, Michigan, is in Livingston County. Livingston County is outside of Detroit. It is the classic suburb with the swing voters that Trump needs to win. So, and he's in Howell because it's the biggest city in Livingston County. So I think there are two stories here. One is, yes, this plays into the story that Donald Trump wants to tell his base, that he is one of them. But it also, he has to win these votes, and he has to go to places like Livingston County, and avoiding Howell would be giving up on some of those key voters that he needs.
And joining me now is Ian Sams, Senior Advisor to the Harris-Walz campaign. Ian, welcome back to the Saturday Show. Good to see you, too. You've only been in this new job how many days?
Like 4 or 5. Started on Monday. What a week.
What a week. I mean, an incredible convention. I was there for all of it. You were coming into the convention with momentum. You left Chicago with momentum. How do you keep it going?
Well, you mentioned it in the early part of the show. The Vice President and Governor Walz are going to be going to Georgia this week to campaign. South Georgia, Savannah area, a lot of time spent in Atlanta. We also want to be focusing in Savannah. We've been invested in Georgia for a really long time now. We have 170 some odd staffers across the state. We have 24 field offices across the state. That's the kind of on-the-ground activity that we're going to be doing in the coming weeks as we capitalize on the momentum and the energy that we saw at the convention to be able to actually be in communities talking to voters. You saw it when they did their bus tour in Western Pennsylvania last week, going to a football practice there, talking to people where they are. That's how you kind of capture the momentum of these big moments. You inspire people. You get volunteers who are willing to talk to people in their communities and knock on doors, and you try to mobilize them to go get the message out in November. So she's going to be out there. He's going to be out there. We're really excited about that trip this week.
You know, today the Trump campaign put out what could only be described as a pre-buttal memo saying, hey, you know, the nominees usually get a convention bump coming out of their convention, and she's going to get one too. It's going to be, albeit temporary. And then at the end, it says, you know, it's not national polls we should be paying attention to. It's the state polls. We got to get to 270. And then they say, we are sticking to our winning plan of getting President Trump reelected. From your vantage point, what's their winning plan?
Well, it's going to be a close race. We're a very divided country. He has strong support among Republican voters, as you know. So we're working really hard to win this campaign. We can't rest on our laurels. We're inspired right now. What we saw this week was inspiring. I think that that's an important currency in politics and in campaigns, to have people feel inspired. But we have to go out on the field and win the game. And so with President Trump, I think one thing that we've been seeing over the last week especially, I don't think he knows how to handle her. I think that he doesn't understand what he's up against. He doesn't understand that his dark, gloomy, dystopic vision like we saw yesterday with RFK and the Federal Anti-Vax Commission or whatever it is that they were announcing. I don't think that he understands how that plays in contrast to the patriotic message that you saw from Democrats this week, from Vice President Harris, who was talking about the values that we share as a country and outlining a vision that actually impacts people's lives, taking on costs, whether it's housing, whether it's groceries, things that really matter to people. That's what she's talking about. He's ranting and rambling because he doesn't have a message that appeals to the American people.
He was ranting and rambling during her speech on his janky social media platform, calling into Fox News at one point in all caps. Is she talking about me? I find it interesting that you say he doesn't know how to handle her. What is it about Vice President Harris you think rankles Donald Trump so much?
I think that she's strong. She's a fighter. She's a prosecutor. She knows how to prosecute the political case against Donald Trump extraordinarily effectively, whether it's the way he tore away our freedoms, reproductive freedoms, economic freedoms, freedoms to vote, the things that he did when he appointed Supreme Court justices who took away these fundamental rights that have existed for so long. Those are the kind of things that he doesn't know how to handle because he's dealing with someone who's effectively prosecuting that case against him every day. And she's doing that because she's wanting to make sure that the American people know what's at stake in this election. Are we going to move forward or are we going to go backward? Are we going to be optimistic and patriotic? Or are we going to be dark and angry and ranting and getting so rattled that you're beeping the phone with your cheek because you don't know how to talk about Kamala Harris like he was on Fox News? He's struggling with not being the center of attention, obviously, but that's the difference between the two of them. Vice President Harris doesn't need to be the center of attention. She wants the country to be the center of attention. Donald Trump just wants people to talk about himself. And so she's energizing these millions of Americans to rally behind the vision that she's outlining of a new way forward for this country. And I think he doesn't really quite understand how to fight back against that.
You know, one of the things he was saying in the weeks leading up to the Democratic convention, and then it became part of the conversation, was she only talks on a teleprompter. She won't sit down with the press. When is she going to do an interview and take, extemporaneous questions? We know from NBC News is reporting that both Vice President Harris and Governor Walz will do their first joint interview next week. It's unclear, though, with whom and when that will happen. Who's got the interview?
Well, you're talking about Donald Trump's critiques. I can tell you right now unequivocally that their first interview will not be a 2-hour-long ramble with Elon Musk. Okay, so she said she'll do an interview by the end of the month. But the other thing I think people kind of have forgotten is she's been out on the trail almost every week, almost every day for the last month since she entered this race. And she's been taking reporters' questions while she's on the trail, walking over to folks who are there covering her campaign events, taking their questions, helping them understand how this campaign is going, being responsive to the questions that they have about her policy vision or her agenda or anything like that. But she's also been the vice president all year, and she's done about 80 interviews this year alone. And so this is someone who has consistently engaged with the press. And as she said, she'll do an interview by the end of the month.
Right, a sit-down interview.
Yeah, but she said she's going to do an interview. I'm not going to break news on which interview we will do on this show, especially because there may be some people in this room who are trying to get it, but she'll be talking to the press very soon.
I had to try, Ian. I don't
blame you.
September 10th is the first, maybe even only, presidential debate between Vice President Harris and former President Donald Trump. Is there the expectation that there will be another one?
Well, as Vice President Harris has said, she's game if he shows up at the first one. He's kind of sending weird mixed messages, trying to turn this into a Fox News thing, trying to claim that she's like changing the game a little bit. No, we've agreed to a debate. We're looking forward to that debate. I think that there's not enough attention being paid to it. President Trump is practicing for his debate. It was in the New York Times yesterday that they've been spending more time this year preparing for this debate than he has in any of his past campaigns. And he runs a serious operation. They're led by real people who are probably practicing and working really hard to get it. So, I think that it'll be interesting what happens on that day. I think that the vice president's going to show up and be who she was on Thursday night, where she prosecutes the case against him politically and make sure the American people know what's at stake in the election.
Ian Sams, 4 days into the new job, senior advisor of the Harris-Walz campaign. Thank you very much for coming to the Saturday Show.
The campaign announced today it has raised $540 million in 5 weeks since the vice president launched her campaign. 200,000 volunteer shifts were filled up last week, nearly half of them on the heels of the vice president's acceptance speech. The Trump camp is calling the enthusiasm a sugar high that will crash as memory of the convention fades. What's your take on this?
I think that voters have been tired of Donald Trump's dystopian views and just how negative he is about this country. As President Biden said, you can't love this country only when you win, and that's exactly who Donald Trump is. He only is in this election for himself. He only wants to implement an extreme Project 2025 agenda to hurt people. But look, the energy and enthusiasm that we're seeing, a lot of these donors are first-time donors. These are people who are just now getting engaged in politics. It's because they're resonating with the message from the vice president, and that is a message of creating an opportunity in this country for everybody not to just get by, but to be able to get ahead. There are two distinct visions in this country for the future. One under Vice President Harris and Governor Walz, where we're expanding people's freedoms, not ripping them away, and giving everybody an opportunity to succeed. And another on Donald Trump's side, where he will have more power as commander-in-chief and use that power to hurt people by implementing his extreme and unstable Project 2025 agenda.
Having said that, do you feel that the campaign will be able to maintain this high volume of donors and small donors, that it will continue to be able to do that at this level going into the last 70-plus days?
Absolutely, and I think it's because we're going to continue to put in the work as we have been for the past 16 months to build an infrastructure where we have 1,600 staff across the ground, 300-plus coordinated offices, making sure that we're able to capture this energy, give people in the states that matter most in this election a place to go, to volunteer, to be involved. I encourage everybody to go to KamalaHarris.com to figure out a way that they can be involved in this campaign, but we are going to continue to scale and make sure that we're meeting voters where we are by being innovative and running a modern-day campaign that is spreading the message about what's at stake in this election.
Now, let's turn now to immigration. The Trump campaign has been promising mass deportations if elected. Today, Trump's running mate, Ohio Senator J.D. Vance, struggled to answer whether a second Trump White House would mean a return to Trump's policies of separating migrant families at the southern border. Take a listen.
Will families be separated under your mass deportation policy?
I think that families are currently being separated, and you're certainly going to have to deport some people in this country. Now, I think you start
that's a yes?
with what Kamala Harris says is that Donald Trump wants to separate families. Kamala Harris's policies have led to thousands upon thousands of migrant children living with sex traffickers and drug cartels.
Well,
that is the consequence of her policies.
But there's not
Some
a
of them are
policy to
even missing.
separate families. There's not a policy to separate families.
Oh, if you know that your policies will lead to family separation, you don't get to claim. Kristen, this is important.
Hold on.
Kamala Harris cannot claim that she doesn't know that her policies are leading to family separation. They are, and everybody knows it, and she has to take responsibility.
Your candidate has called for the passage of the bipartisan immigration bill that Trump had his allies in Congress kill. We had former Houston, Texas Mayor Sylvester Turner with us yesterday on the show, and he lauded Vice President Harris for taking responsibility for the border issue. Have Democrats become the party of action on immigration?
Absolutely, and I think we see J.D. Vance ducking and dodging because he knows that Donald Trump's policy on immigration would go as far as using the military to separate children from their mothers, round up migrants and put them in detention camps. There is a way to solve the crisis at the border without being inhumane about it. And Republicans failed to see that, which is why Donald Trump instructed Republicans in Congress to blow up the strongest, most bipartisan border bill that this country has seen. Vice President Harris would have supported that bill. And there's a way that we can do this. Democrats know that. Some Republicans in Congress even know that. And that's why they sided with President Harris or Vice President Harris and President Biden to try to get a deal done before Donald Trump blew it up. But this shouldn't be that hard. Family separation should be out of the question. And we're going to continue to work to make sure that we solve this crisis. Vice President Harris is going to continue to work to make sure she solves this, and at the same time do it where folks can earn a pathway to citizenship. We can solve this problem without being inhumane about it, and J.D. Vance is ducking and dodging because he knows just how inhumane Donald Trump's approach has been and will be to solve the immigration problem at the border.
In fact, as a point of information, that one of the leaders of that bipartisan immigration bill was a very conservative Republican member of the Senate until Trump called Republicans and said, don't go with the commitment they had made to pass this bill. Let me go to this. The vice president and the governor are back on the trail later this week for a campaign bus tour through southern Georgia, where polls now show a narrowed race, whereas President Biden was trailing just over a month ago. But still, while the latest New York Times polling shows Harris leading in nearly every battleground state, Georgia is one of two where she's currently behind Trump at 46% to his 50%. How does the campaign turn the corner in the Peach State? Is it about mobilizing base voters or reaching out to undecided voters in the suburbs and rural areas?
It's all of the above, Reverend, and we're running like we're behind and we're the underdogs because we are. We're going to continue to put in work. But when it comes to Georgia, as you know, this is one of my favorite states to do politics in, and we have to get us out of Atlanta. We do have to turn out and mobilize base voters, no doubt about it. But we also have to speak to voters in rural Georgia, in the suburbs, in places like Savannah, in Augusta, in Columbus, in Macon County. And to do that, we will shave down on the margins, if not outright win some of these counties. And that is how you flip this state and win statewide. And so we're going to continue to do that. And these voters, we also see Republican voters that are resonating with our message. You saw throughout the convention, we had a number of prominent Republicans featured. And it's because even Republican voters know exactly how extreme and dangerous a second Donald Trump term would be, which is why they are endorsing Vice President Harris, speaking at the Democratic National Convention about the dangers of Donald Trump, including Republicans who have worked for him. And so we're going to continue to do all of the above. And at the same time, making sure we're building an apparatus specifically in Georgia, because we know how Republicans play game there, to make sure that people are going to be able to express their fundamental right to vote. And I'm very proud of the voter protection efforts that our campaign has that will be used in that state to make sure that the election goes off smoothly when it's time.
While there's time, Mr. Fox, I have to go to this. As the Trump campaign is celebrating its endorsement from Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who suspended his own presidential campaign last week, Senator Vance on today's Meet the Press would not renounce Kennedy's past comments suggesting vaccines cause autism and questioning the official narrative of what happened on 9/11. What's your take on Kennedy's endorsement of Trump?
It changes nothing in this race. RFK has been negligible since the moment the vice president got into this race. And in fact, if voters want to continue to see dangerous conspiracy theories that are designed to hurt people, look no further than Donald Trump. They're cut from the same cloth. And so our campaign is very clear about who we need to continue to speak to, where we need to go to speak to them, and what our message is for voters. And that's that at the end of the day, this election is a fundamental choice between two different visions in this country, one of an opportunity looking forward agenda where everybody has a chance to get ahead, not just get by, but to get ahead, where we're going to expand freedom and rights, and the other, dangerous conspiracy theory, a dangerous and divisive plan called Project 2025, where Donald Trump is the supreme leader and has power that he will use to hurt people and continue to rip away fundamental freedoms like the right to choose and come after things like IVF and reproductive tools that women in this country have. And so we know what we're fighting for, and we're going to continue to communicate with voters where they are, exactly that message, and we're confident that we're going to be successful in November.
During this week's Democratic National Convention, one of the most consistent and effective lines of attack against Donald Trump was framing the presidential election as a race between a fraudster and a convict, and a former prosecutor who has spent her life representing the people.
As a prosecutor, when I had a case, I charged it not in the name of the victim, but in the name of the people. For a simple reason. In our system of justice, a harm against any one of us is a harm against all of us. Donald Trump tried to throw away your votes. When he failed, he sent an armed mob to the United States Capitol where they assaulted law enforcement officers. When politicians in his own party begged him to call off the mob and send help, he did the opposite. He fanned the flames.
She did not hold back there. Joining me now is someone who has been very effective at holding Donald Trump accountable, New York Attorney General Letitia James. It's so great to see you, Attorney General James. Thank you so much for joining me today. I just wanted to start with, there's so much for people to wade through when it comes to legal cases. And one of the reasons that Democrats could go out there and call Trump a fraud and a cheat is because you and your fraud case against Trump helped make the case on that front. So if you were speaking to voters out there who are trying to wade through all this, what would you highlight about what that case says about him personally and as a candidate?
A $454 million judgment where he wildly exaggerated the value of his assets. And what we are seeking now is disgorgement. We are recovering, obviously, his ill-gotten gains that inured to the benefit not only of Donald Trump, but his family and all of those who worked for the Trump organization. No one is above the law. And it was simply put, and it was basically emphasized at the convention. And the convention obviously was just magnificent. It was electrifying. The ground shifted from the first day where we gave flowers to President Biden because he embodies the spirit of FDR, to the great communicators, the Obamas, and then to the Clintons, the great explainers, and then to, of course, the Coach Waltz, who is someone who I would love to be my neighbor. He reminds me of Mr. Rogers, and I love Mr. Rogers.
Who doesn't?
Exactly. And then to, of course, the woman of the hour, our Vice President Harris, who basically gave one of the greatest summations that I have heard.
Her speech was so powerful. I mean, she looked to me like she could just walk right into the Situation Room. That's what I've been saying. One of the things that's been so interesting to me, and I wonder how it struck you, is that Trump, another powerful part of her speech was what she said about abortion rights. She talks about it so passionately and personally. And Trump is having a hard time responding to the Democratic convention. I mean, the best he could do was try to claim that his administration will, quote, be great for women and their reproductive rights. That's what he said. And that Republicans are a leader on IVF. Obviously, I had a hard time keeping a straight face reading that out, but you're very familiar with these issues. You've talked about them a lot, too. What do you make of that claim?
Listen, in order to have a functioning democracy, it's really critically important that individuals understand that what is key to a functioning democracy is respecting the rights of individuals, having liberties, having freedoms. And all of those freedoms and liberties are at risk right now. Mr. Trump and his administration represents an existential threat to all that we believe in. Project 2025 is something that Democratic attorney generals are familiar with. Back in 2016, we defended our democracy. They attempted to put forward aspects of Project 2025, and we were successful 80% of the time in winning our cases. Now, that manifesto has been written down, and we are prepared, obviously, to defend our democracy and to defend our freedoms, standing up for liberties and justice, standing up for the rights of women, standing up for the rights of unions, standing up for the rights of seniors, because he proposes to privatize Social Security. It's really critically important that individuals understand that what Donald Trump represents, and that's why all of us must march in quiet defiance to the polls on Election Day and vote for freedom, vote for liberty, and vote for democracy, and vote for a functioning democracy that respects the rights of all individuals. Not criticism, not grievances, not division, but unity. And that was reflected, again, with that roll call during the convention when everyone proudly respected their states. And, you know, I was sort of jealous of Illinois when Little John came down the steps, which is why I grabbed Spike Lee and said, New York, you know, we need you over here. And he gladly joined us during the roll call.
You were feeling a little competitive. New York had to bring some fun to the, you know, I saw that happen.
We did.
It was, I mean, the contrast is so stark. And Project 2025 is such a good reminder. You've actually done the studying of it. It's so important for people to know what's in there. There is a darkness coming, of course, from the other side. We're already seeing Trump dabbling in gross racist, misogynistic attacks against Vice President Harris. I expect that's going to become worse over the next couple of months. She seems ready for it, but you are also an incredibly accomplished Black woman who has had to deal with these kind of gross attacks from Trump. Is there anything you learned about dealing with that sort of thing that you hope people use over the next couple months?
Yeah, I've been the subject of his attacks, but at the end of the day, the reality is that being the first in anything is nothing more than a historical footnote. People want to know, what are you going to do with the power that lies in your hand? How are you going to transform the lives of others? How are you going to address their felt needs each and every day? How can you use government as a tool, obviously, of progress moving forward? That's what we've got to demonstrate, that it's really not about us. It's not about these historical footnotes. It's about making and improving the lives of Americans, and in my case, the lives of New Yorkers. And that is what I do each and every day. And, you know, I walk into that office with this fire in my belly to see how can we improve the life of New Yorkers? How can we defend the law? What can we do to defend the rights of individuals who are under attack, members of the LGBTQ community, women, workers, unions, seniors, individuals, obviously, in upstate New York, farmers using antitrust laws, given the consolidation of power. And it's important that individuals understand that consolidation of power in the hands of one man, Donald Trump, is very, very dangerous. And individuals have to know that as Democrats, that we must use the law both as a sword and as a shield, and again, improve the lives of Americans and New Yorkers. And that is what I do each and every day. Again, focusing on corporations that are only concerned about the bottom line profit. And again, unfortunately, with these fees and with consolidation of power and with antitrust laws and consumer fraud and landlords that are purchasing a property day in and day out, these corporate landlords, we've got to challenge those abilities and standing up for our democracy and standing up for our rights. It's important that individuals understand that is what Americans would like to see in their government and would like to see in their attorney generals. And as Democratic attorney generals, we do that. We did it in 2016, beating back Donald Trump and his attorneys 80% of the time. And it's an honor and a privilege to stand with a great group of Democratic attorney generals who are prepared to do it once again.
Well, I think anybody watching is thinking to themselves, New York Attorney General Letitia James has a fire in her belly on Sunday mornings as well. So thank you for joining us. Thank you for all the things you're fighting for. It was a real pleasure talking to you this morning.
Reproductive rights took center stage at the Dem Convention earlier this week as we heard really heartbreaking stories from families punished by Republican restrictions. Here's Amanda and Josh Zarowski, a Texas couple who were denied medical care under their state's abortion ban.
My heart breaks. For the baby girl we wanted desperately. For the doctors and nurses who couldn't help me deliver her safely. For Josh, who feared he would lose me too. But I was lucky. I lived. So I'll continue sharing our story, standing with women and families across the country.
In a new exclusive interview with NBC's Priscilla Thompson, Amanda Zarowski said this about the impact that she hopes sharing her story will have.
Even though it's really difficult, it's also so important and very motivating. I like to say that this is really exhausting and it puts me to bed at night, but it also is what gets me up in the morning because this is the fight that we have to fight in order to make change.
Joining us now is Michigan Attorney General Dana Nessel. General Nessel, first of all, can you just talk about how in Michigan you all have moved to protect the rights of people all over your state to be able to make their own decisions, and how perhaps what's happening in Michigan could be a model for other states across the country?
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks for having me. In the wake of the 2022 Dobbs decision, immediately our very draconian 1931 abortion ban with virtually no exceptions went back into effect. And, similarly to what Kamala Harris had done with Prop 8 back in 2011, I said I will not enforce this abortion prohibition, meaning I won't prosecute women or their doctors for what would have been a fundamental right for 50 years, nor will I defend this law when plaintiffs bring a challenge to it, because, we had well over 2 million women of reproductive age in our state, and I didn't run for office to jeopardize the health, safety, and welfare of my constituents. So ultimately, what happened was the law was challenged. It was put on hold until we could bring a ballot initiative, which was known as Reproductive Freedom for All. And it passed in November of 2022 with resounding numbers. And it didn't just protect abortion rights, but also the right to birth control, to manage a miscarriage, and also to fertility treatments. So that was, obviously something that was impressive, and it allowed people in Michigan to feel safe about reproductive care. However, I think it's very important for people to note that at any time, a decision by the United States Supreme Court or a federal ban that's put in place, were we to lose Congress and the presidency on abortion, would supersede everything that we have managed to accomplish in Michigan and in similar states.
Well, on that point about a federal ban, Senator J.D. Vance is on Meet the Press with our colleague Kristen Welker. We have an early piece of that interview. Take a listen to what he has to say about a national abortion ban.
Can you commit, Senator, sitting right here with me today, that if you and Donald Trump are elected, that you will not impose a federal ban on abortion?
I can absolutely commit that, Kristen. And Donald Trump has been as clear about that as possible.
But would he veto it?
Yeah, I mean, if you're not supporting it as the President of the United States, you fundamentally have to veto it.
So he would veto a federal abortion ban?
I think he would. He said that explicitly, that he would.
I do not agree that he has been as clear as possible, AG Nessel, and great chance this ultimately would get litigated out in a second Trump term. I wonder if you take J.D. Vance at his word and how you look at it as a law enforcement authority.
Well, first of all, I think between Donald Trump and J.D. Vance, you have two of the most opportunist individuals ever to enter public service, right? They will say or do anything that helps to get them elected, but that doesn't mean that that's how they're going to serve once they're in office. But aside from whatever Trump or Vance wants, or even Congress, let's look at it this way. Whether you're talking about the Mifepristone case that went to the United States Supreme Court, or the case involving emergency health care, when a woman literally, is bleeding out and dying, whether or not she has to be treated in a hospital, remember, both of those cases were not decided on the merits. One, it was said that the plaintiffs lacked standing to bring that case. In the other, the decision was that it was improvidently granted. So there was no decision on the merits. Those cases could go back to the United States Supreme Court. And if so, you're really talking about, in the case of Mifepristone, over half the abortions in Michigan are performed using abortion medication. That still could be eliminated so that there's still all these ways to chip away at abortion rights and birth control and so many other fundamental rights that have been protected for a long time, irrespective of what Congress or a president does, simply because of who we have on the United States Supreme Court. And that's why I've been screaming from the rooftops, all our, most sacred fundamental rights are in jeopardy if we have the wrong people on the court. We have, two individuals on the court, maybe three if you include Sonia Sotomayor, that may not last for another presidential term. And of course, that includes Alito and Thomas. And it is so essential that we have Kamala Harris in the White House so that she can be nominating people who care about protecting our essential freedoms. And whether that's abortion, birth control, whether that's about, the ability to have environmental regulations, whether it's even about the ability to prohibit public funding of private schools, which is a case that's pending right now from my state. Before the United States Supreme Court, they are considering taking that case. And of course, that would apply to all 50 states. So I think people have to remember that each and every one of our fundamental rights could be eviscerated if we don't select the right person to be president of the United States and a Senate who will confirm the right people to be justices on that court.
Michigan Attorney General Dana Nessel, I am just so glad you could join us today. You are one of the stars, rising stars, frankly, in the party that graced the DNC stage earlier this week. And if anyone missed what you had to say there, they got just a glimpse of it today.